Hi, my name is Katie and I'm the director at the Clark Historical Museum in Old Town Eureka. And today I'll be speaking about preserving heirloom quilts and textiles as part of the Redwood Art Association's Focus on Fiber exhibit in 2021. So why is it important to preserve our textiles? So they're all around us. They make up the fabric of our lives, if you will, and they help us record our personal histories, our family histories. They decorate our walls, and they give us an idea of how things have changed over time. So it's really important to focus on preserving heirloom quilts and other types of textiles. So when you first receive a new textile item, I like to do what's called speed dating. And that is to collect as much information on this textile as possible. So things like who made it, when did they make it, why did they make it, if it has a pattern, what pattern is it, what materials are in it. You also want to get photos of the piece, so that's helpful for insurance purposes, and so you know what it looks like if something happens to it, if it gets stolen or it gets damaged in, a disaster or something like that. If you purchased it, you want to write down where and from how much it cost. If you have any appraisals of it done, you want to write that down as well. And part of what's really important about this particular step is that the age of the textile and what it's made out of can help you with later steps in this process, such as determining how this textile piece is likely to degrade over time. One particular example of this is this quilt here on the right. It's a log cabin. It's a beautiful quilt, but you can kind of see how it started falling apart. This quilt is made out of silk, and at the time, silks were weighted, which meant that they had added salts and other kinds of things to make them weigh more because they were sold by weight at the time. But unfortunately, that's not very good for the preservation of the silks, and they end up falling apart over time. So once you have all this information, anything else that might be important that you can think of, any information that came with the piece when you got it, you want to keep all of that information with the item. So whether that's attached to a box lid, in a box with the quilt, tied onto a roll if you roll the quilt, which we'll talk a bit about that in a little bit. But you want to be sure that this information is close at hand with the quilt and doesn't get lost. So after you've done your speed dating step, you should have a decent idea of the age of your quilt, and kind of your quilt's backstory. So now in this next step, you want to take into consideration things that could be threats to your textiles. So things like if there's prior damage or ongoing damage, you want to take pictures of that in order to record if the damage is getting worse with time. That's what we were doing in these two photos, the one on the far left and the middle, was we were taking photos of this kind of dirt spot that you see here on the right, or on the left. And then on the right there, we're taking notes of the silk that's fallen apart off of this quilt. You also want to take into consideration things that could be current threats to your textile, things like light, moisture, acids, which are found in the quilts naturally, just based on the materials they're made out of. And you want to be sure you don't add to the acids that the quilt already experiences. So you don't want to put them in cedar chests. I know that's a very popular thing when it comes to storing quilts because it keeps moths out, but cedar, especially untreated cedar, has a lot of acid in it, so it can actually end up staining your quilt over time. So you want to avoid that. You also want to take into consideration, is there any pest damage to the quilt? Do you have pests in a place where you might be storing the quilt? You also want to look at oils, things like in your hands, or, coming out of the walls or something like that onto your item. There's also folds, the quilt folding itself. You can see on the left here, there's lines and obvious creases in the quilt where it was folded for a really long time. Also, just the passage of time is a threat to your textile. And you can't really mitigate that, or you can't really stop that. You can mitigate it by taking into consideration all of the previous things I've listed. And of course, also themselves. Just if they're old, they fall apart. If they're being used, they fall apart. If they're weighted silk, like I mentioned previously, they can also just degrade like that. But then You also want to do some research as well. So if you're dealing with, for example, leather, that degrades and ages over time very differently than, say, silk or cotton. Leather might experience drying or cracking. That might not happen to things like cotton or woven fabrics. And same thing, you want to look for ways to notice advancing damage and ways to mitigate or reduce that damage in these different types of textiles. So like on the far right here, this is a headdress in the Neelis Hall collection. It's got iris fibers, which is kind of that net looking structure there, but it also has feathers. And the way that feathers degrade can be very different from the way that iris fibers degrade. So taking that into consideration, you can find a way to store your item that is safe for both types of fibers, rather than being safe for one but maybe detrimental to the other. And on that same topic, if your piece is mixed media, say for instance, if you had this dress in your collection, if you did, please let me know because I love this photo of this dress. But if the item is mixed media, sometimes one medium can affect another one and speed up its degradation or slow it down, which can be kind of interesting when that happens. But if you look at all the different types of materials and see how they can interact with one another, that's going to make a big difference in how you decide to store your item. And then, of course, there's handling your textile, which is going to be happening all throughout this process of when you're taking photos of it, when you're documenting the structure and the layout of the item. But when you're handling them, there's some very important things to keep in mind. So of course you want to wash and dry your hands. You want to remove any jewelry that might snag on whatever item you're dealing with. When it comes to gloves, there's kind of differing philosophies on that, but you definitely want to wear gloves if preservatives might be present. That can be depending on the age of the item or the type of textile. For instance, we do have, it's not this one, but we do have items in the Neelis Hall basket collection that do have a type of pesticide on them. That was a way that back in the day museum people would prevent pests from attacking museum collection items, as they'd put these really harsh pesticides on them. It doesn't necessarily affect the structure of the item, but it can be really bad if you handle that and then say touch your face or something. And also for things like taxidermy animals, like we have a condor in the museum collection that has arsenic on it. So that kind of thing was common at that period in time when it came to preserving textiles. So it's really important to label if you know, for instance, that your textile has some sort of preservative on it that could be harmful. You want to be definitely sure that that is labeled. So in case someone else has to handle the textile, they know and can take precautions. You also want to wear gloves to prevent the oils on your hands from transferring to the items you're handling. However, if the item is particularly fragile and your dexterity in your hands might be compromised by the gloves, you can handle them without gloves on. But you kind of need to balance the whole oils on your hands, fragility of the item before you make that decision. When you're handling an item, you want to watch out for weak spots, holes, fraying, fragile seams, things like that. Lace especially is really scary when it comes to handling it. One way you can also handle items is to put them on a piece of cardboard. And you can move them around that way if you need to keep it totally flat. Silks can, break and fray really easily if they're handled too much or folded or things like that. So you want to be really careful. For larger items, you want to have a friend help you when you're hanging the item or folding it or moving it, especially if it's fragile. That's really important. And for the case of things like, baskets or pieces that have handles, you want to try to pick up the item by the largest, sturdiest part. So you don't want to pick it up by the handle. Say, for instance, on this basket, it has a little handle looped in. Those handles and things can become compromised with time, and if you pick it up, it might break off. So you want to carry it, say, by the base of the basket with both hands. And if it has multiple pieces, you want to try to move one piece at a time so a piece doesn't fly off or fall. You can also carry multiple smaller pieces in a sturdy box if you have a bunch of small items. But of course, you always want to err on the side of caution when handling items so they don't break. And with that, take your time moving them. You don't need to be racing around moving your items. It's better to be careful. So of course we don't have textile items just to keep them in a closet. We want to display them sometimes. So before you display your items, you want to take a couple things into consideration. You want to be sure it's stable to be able to display. For instance, like this quilt on the right here, you want to be sure that its seams are sturdy enough that it can be hung. In particular for things like quilts, you can add a hanging sleeve onto the back. It's just kind of a muslin tube that you can sew on, usually by hand sewing, to the back, and that helps distribute the weight evenly across the top of the quilt. Sometimes we use binder clips and pieces of thick batting to pin or to clip items onto hanging racks like this. That does work as well, but sometimes it just doesn't look as clean. So there's that. You want to avoid high sunny areas. So this picture on the left here, this is a photo of the Hover basket collection at Elsie Hover's home. You can notice that there's a pretty bright window right next to some of the items. You want to avoid sunny areas generally, especially because it can cause uneven fading. Like you can see these caps kind of near the center of the image that are hanging on what looks like a post. You could I would definitely say that you could see on one side the caps are getting way more light than the other side, leading to some fading on one side if they were to be there for a long period of time. You also want to avoid high humidity areas. In a place like Humboldt County, that's a little bit difficult, but you don't want to be displaying it in a garage or something like that. You want to also avoid areas with rapidly changing humidity and temperature. That can be a great place for mold to grow, so you need to be really careful. You also want to watch out for pets and kids that might step on it, jump on it, tear it, things like that. You also want to check on the item frequently for damage or degradation over time. If you start seeing damage occur or accelerate, you want to take it off display as soon as you can. See if there might be a way to mitigate that damage and then reevaluate. You also want to swap out your items on display every few months so they don't degrade unevenly or things like that. It also kind of makes it fun to see what's new on display in the home. You also want to keep them off the floor to avoid pests, pets, children, spills, all that kind of stuff. And you also want to keep the area around the textile item clean and dust-free to prevent pests, mold, especially here in Humboldt County, and dust. So many people don't realize, but at a museum in particular, most items spend most of their time in storage. They come out for displays every couple years, but we have a lot of items that are in storage, not currently on display. So taking care of your items in storage is very important. So for things, large flat textiles like quilts, a good practice is to refold them twice a year or lay them out on a bed flat so they can relax. You can do that on spare bedrooms or inflatable mattresses. This is also a good opportunity to invite your friends over and check out all your cool quilts when you unfold and then later refold them. It also makes it easy to have that buddy system to move and fold your quilts. This is also a good time to take photos of damaged areas and review them once a year or more to check if damage is advancing, particularly for molds and pests, as is pretty common here in Humboldt County. So I mentioned boxes. It's really important to store your items in acid-free boxes. As I mentioned, acids are already present in quilts, but you don't want to add more acids to your item when it's in storage. So a really important thing to note is that not all acid-free boxes are created equally. You'll be able to find acid-free boxes all over the place, places like Joann's, art stores, things like that. And you'll also see a bunch that are stated to be archive quality. There's not a standard for determining archive quality. That's just kind of a thing that everyone says. If you want to use the same boxes that we use here at the museum, you can go through companies like Gaylord Products or University Archives, and they can help you find the right box that you need. Those are usually made out of a gray kind of cardboard. Sometimes it's black or blue. You can kind of see it in the background of these two pictures, these gray boxes. And that can help with the life of your textile. They can be a little pricey, so just keep that in mind. But if you're looking at storing this over your lifetime and possibly, children's lifetimes or things like that, it does end up being worth it. It also protects your textiles very well. If you're storing your quilts in a box, you only want to store 1 to 2 quilts per box. The weight of one quilt on top of the other can force creases into the quilt. It's also extra weight on the fibers that can cause them to break faster. And then you also want to be sure that between each layers of the folded quilt is acid-free tissue paper. So it's kind of the same thing here. But the thing with acid-free tissue paper, if you buy it from a larger company like Gaylord or University Products, you'll end up getting, a 300-foot roll of it. You don't necessarily need that if you're only going to be storing a couple quilts. You can also use unbleached muslin to put in between the layers of the quilt. And what that does is it absorbs those acids that are coming off of the quilt, and it puts them into something that isn't the quilt. And over time, it'll remove those acids. They'll still continue to be an issue, but at least they're not compounding on themselves. If you're using muslin, you want to wash it every couple years or so. And you want to be sure it's unbleached muslin if you're doing that. Also with tissue paper, if you do go that route, there are buffered and unbuffered types. You need to look at what your textile piece is made out of before picking buffered or unbuffered, because each of these types work for different types of materials. And Gaylord and some of the other companies have pretty good resources on understanding what the difference between buffered and unbuffered tissue paper is. When your item's in storage, you also want to monitor your storage conditions, humidity and temperature particularly. You want to store in an area with a stable temperature and humidity. Avoid places like garages, basements, attics, things that aren't insulated. And also be sure it's in an easily accessible place so you can check on it. And in case you have to take it with you, if there's an emergency, you can get to it quickly and take it with you. So another option for storage besides folding it and putting it into boxes is rolling, which I'll cover in the next slide. So a couple years ago, we received some grant funding from the Redwood Empire Quilters Guild to update some of our storage for our quilts and to also get some better documentation on them. So these are some pictures of that project. So here on the left, you can see Shauna, who is our intern we were able to hire on for this project, just putting the finishing touches on a rolled quilt. And then the rolled quilts are put on the hanging rack seen on the right here. On this particular picture, we had only rolled the quilts on, I think, the very top shelf, so you could kind of see the situation that the other quilts were in that hadn't been re-rolled recently. But in the end of the project, we ended up re-rolling all of those. They were completely covered in tissue paper, tied with muslin ties with a tag on it that said what quilt it was, the accession number, which is how we keep track of where things are, and also the last time that paper was replaced. This paper needs to be replaced about every 5 years to get rid of accumulated acids. So this is a really safe way for storing quilts. It's not the most space-savvy way of storing quilts, but the reason why this is generally better than putting things in boxes is that it keeps the weight of folds off of the quilt. There's a more equal distribution of tension on the quilt, so you're not pulling at fibers at the fold lines. The only thing is that you can't do this for every textile if your piece is really fragile. If it has a lot of seams, like crazy quilts, you don't generally want to roll them. So you should box those. Also, if they're smaller, you don't really need to roll them. You can lay them flat in a box. And also, you can kind of include in the folds, you can take some rolled up tissue paper to kind of prop the fold up a little bit so it's not such a harsh bend in the fabric. So this is just another option for storing quilts. And I have seen people store their quilts this way at home. Sometimes they'll use something like a pool noodle with a dowel put through it. Those plastics are technically stable, but it's probably one of those things that you would want to check up on just to be sure the plastic isn't degrading in a weird way. But I've seen people do that and then hang them on walls or things like that. But especially in Humboldt County, you need to watch out for mold on walls. But that is another option of doing that. So this is an example of some of the boxed textiles. So this was before we replaced the paper in them. So you can see there are these gray cardboard boxes. They have metal corners on them to keep them stable. This is a cigar silk quilt, which is made out of these tiny strips of silks that were tied around cigars. People collected them in the Victorian period and made really incredible quilts out of them. So this is an example of one of those quilts that we couldn't roll, so it was stored in a box. So if I were to refold this quilt as it's pictured now, I would lay it flat, and then as I would fold it, I'd put kind of rolls of tissue paper where the folds are at to support those folds and to make them help keep them from forming creases. You can also see in this particular box there's kind of a silver material at the bottom. That's called Marvel Seal. That's a particular archive product that helps keep out mold and dust and is pretty good for storing items. It can be pretty pricey, so there's that. But it's a nice extra piece of protection for your item. And so, like, there's like on Gaylord Archival Products, they actually sell kits to help you learn how to box your textiles. One, I think it was University Products that might have sent us one once, and they also included a large plastic bag to put the box in once you had everything boxed up. That's to protect the box from unexpected dampness or things like that. But I would really hesitate against doing that because it can create a microclimate in the bag and an accumulation of moisture from the quilts just off-gassing and existing. And also plastics could give off different types of fumes and stuff that can damage quilts and other items. So I would avoid that. And for the same reason, I would also avoid plastic bins for their off-gassing because you don't want that to wreck your quilt after it's been stored for a couple years. So when it comes to the care and cleaning of your textile, it can be really complex based on what the textile is, its structure, its age, past damage that it might have. So you need to be really careful when it comes to cleaning and caring for the item. Prevention is really important, as I mentioned, when it's on display, being sure that it's not getting dirty, things like that is really important. But of course, if an item's on display, it's going to get dirty, it's going to get dust on it. That's just kind of what happens. So if the item doesn't get used all that often or isn't used at all, you won't really have to clean it. You might need to kind of wipe some dust off or things like that, but it's, you don't have to wash it or anything. If it has visible debris on it, you can vacuum it, but what you want to do is you want to have a vacuum hose with a screen on it, and you want to hold it away from the textile. Don't rub it directly on the textile. You want to hold it a little bit away and use a clean paintbrush to kind of flick up any pieces of debris that might be on there. You want to be really careful not to catch fibers. But what that'll do is the screen will distribute the vacuum section a little bit better, and it'll keep your entire textile piece from getting sucked into the vacuum, which would not be good. For quilts specifically, and I'm talking things that are made out of cotton, pretty structurally sound. If it's old and you really don't want to put it in the washing machine, which I definitely advise against putting old quilts in the washing machine, one way to wash them is being really careful. You can put your quilt in a bathtub with a small amount of mild liquid soap, let it soak for a bit, and then rinse a few times to get the soap out. When you dry it, you want to dry it flat on a sheet outside and then flip it to dry both sides. Don't hang the quilt because that can pull on the seams and cause tears and things like that, because all that water adds a lot of extra weight that the quilt's not used to holding. So don't hang dry it. And then there's other situations where if the quilt's dirty, you really just shouldn't clean it. And for example, things like fraying silk, you really don't want to wash that because it can damage it further. So if you're unsure of how old it is, or the stability of it, or if it is unstable, you might want to contact a conservator if it's really important that the item be cleaned. So on the left here is a picture of the canoe that's in Neelis Hall. So this is probably from right around when Neelis Hall opened in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. So for example, on cleaning this canoe, which is a redwood canoe, one of our past registrars, Brittany, when she was working here, she cleaned it, and she took our vacuum cleaner we have, which is a HEPA filter vacuum, and she went through the entire canoe using a brush and vacuuming up any debris that was in it. That was mostly, dust, just from it being on display in the open air over time. So there's many different ways of caring for your textiles, but of course it's of the utmost importance that you do so carefully. So this last slide is just a couple of additional resources, and I'll include the links to these in the description of the video so you can actually go and click on them. But I want to thank you all for tuning in. I hope this presentation and these additional resources are helpful for you in preserving your family's textiles and your family's history in the variety of materials that make up our life. So thank you again, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.